Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Chagigah Daf Dalet, a very interesting one, especially at the end. We're going to get to a very interesting, maybe spooky story at the end of today's daf. I'm actually going to tell you in advance, we're going to go a little bit farther into tomorrow's daf because I don't really want to leave you hanging in the story, and tomorrow's daf is quite long, so I thought it was a good opportunity. This week's learning is sponsored anonymously in honor of Rabbi Raymond Harari. He's been teaching women Gemara for over 42 years, way before it was fashionable. May he be blessed with good health so that he may continue to inspire his students with the love of learning Talmud and Torah. And he was my teacher, so I second that very much so. This week's learning is sponsored by Heather Stone for the Refuah Shlema of Robert Stone, Yehuda Leib ben Naftali Halevi and Chaya. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We ended with this question about Ezehu Shoteh. How do we define what a Shoteh is? And then we saw that there were all these different opinions, not different opinions, there were three different things that the Braita said. And the question is, do you need to do all three, or is it enough to do one of them? And then we said, so that was a machloka between Rav Huna, who says you need all three, and Rabbi Yochanan, who said only one. Then we said, wait a minute, I don't really understand. There's two ways to do any of these actions, either in a bit of a crazy way or in a normal manner. So if you do them in a normal manner, well, then even if you did all three, you shouldn't be a shoteh. This is all a question on Rav Huna's opinion. If you did one of them, even one of them, but in a crazy manner, then you should be a shoteh. So what is Rav Huna talking about? To which we say, no, it's when you do it in a crazy manner, but we still could see justification for what you did. And he gave an example for each one. You could go out at night by yourself, because maybe you have some fever and you got to lower your temperature. You could sleep in the Beit HaKfarot because maybe you're looking for some Ruach Tum'ah, which was a bit of a strange thing, but somehow they thought that was somewhat normal, that you'd be looking maybe to engage in a bit of sorcery, or I don't know what, I'm not sure why that would be normal, but okay. And sometimes people just aren't paying attention and they just start ripping all their clothes. So now they say, the reason, therefore, is that since you did all these things, even though maybe you could justify each one, but already three turns you into, right? And because you did them in a way that was a little bit crazy, you must be a shoteh, okay? Which again means that you don't really have your wits about you. So now, we're going to start from line 2 of our daf. But comes Rav Papa, and he basically is going to knock out Rav Huna, who said you need all three. Amar Rav Papa, Ishmiel Rav Huna Hadran. If Rav Huna had heard the following braita that says, Ezehu shoteh zeha ma'abeg kol ma shenotnim lo. What is a shoteh? It's someone who destroys everything you give him, okay, right? You give him something, throws it on the floor. You give him clothes, rips it, right? Just destroys everything. That is someone who's a shoteh. Now, that's a braita that says it very clearly. Now, what's this connected to? This is like someone who tears their clothing. Now, Rav Huna said, you need all three. This braita makes it clear that one is sufficient, and which one? Well, specifically, at least, tearing clothing. So he basically says if Rav Huna had seen this braita, he for sure would have changed his mind, because he would say, oh, the braita must be more right than I am, and he would have changed his mind. So that's basically a way of knocking out Rav Huna. Comes the Gemara and asks the following question, though. Based on Rav Papa, Ibayalihu, ki hava hadrabe, mi mikak suto hu da hava hadrabe, didam yala laha, o dilma mikulu hava hadra. Does he mean that Rav Huna would have changed his mind about all three, or just about the one who tears his clothing? Because one who tears his clothing is very similar to one who destroys everything you give him. So therefore, are we saying that one would be enough to stand on its own, but the others maybe would require all three, according to Rav Huna still? Or does he mean, no, that's just an indicator that one of these is sufficient and you wouldn't need more than one, and therefore Rav Huna would be taking back his opinion about everything? To which the Gemara answers, teku. Right? Teku, for those who aren't familiar, means it's left to stand. It's really short of the word take home. Take home means to stand, or right, that it will, or maybe it will be established, meaning it's going to wait until we have a better answer. We don't really know. And many people understand it as an abbreviation for tishbi yitaretz kushiot ubayot, that one day Eliyahu will come and he will answer all of our questions. That's more of a drush explanation of that word as opposed to the Aramaic, which is really take home, which is to stand. So basically, we don't really know. What's interesting is halakha l'maaseh, and forget about halakha l'maaseh, even from an understanding perspective, this doesn't mean specifically you're only a shoteh if you did one or three of these things. Obviously, there's other ways where we can define someone as a shoteh. This is an example. But even the halacha, it's quoted that there's other ways that we can determine that someone is, limited with their intellectual abilities and would be in this category where we're going to exempt. Maybe it's a good time now to kind of take a step back and look at the all the exemptions that we've discussed, right? We discussed, I'm going back to the Mishnah now, again, this very strange Mishnah that sort of says, everybody's part of this, but then starts dropping people, right? 1 by 1 or 2 or 3 by 3 or right in categories. Not a cheresh shotev katan, not a tumtum androgynous, not women, not avadim, not right that aren't freed, not the chiger suma choleza ken and anyone who can't walk, right? We basically knocked out all these people. Today, we're going to even see more that are knocked out. It's very interesting to see all these exceptions. Now, again, there's different ways of looking at it. I think another possible way that I didn't talk about before, maybe I thought about this as my daughter was sick yesterday and I couldn't go to shul. My husband went to shul, right? That there's this certain understanding of there's a certain responsibility among these kind of people that it's not so easy, right? Some of them, because of responsibility issues, women, slaves are also in charge of the house. They can't just always pick up and go. So the exemption is kind of helping them out so that if they're in a difficult situation and they can't get on Aliyah, like if you think about it, I was thinking, why this mitzvah of all, that we have so many exemptions? Because imagine nowadays, I mean, forget about that, it's COVID now and it's hard to travel, but travel is definitely much easier than it was, despite even the fact that now with COVID, it's definitely more difficult to travel. But in those days, right, to travel to Jerusalem was definitely not simple, depending on where you live, depending on where you were, depending on, again, your responsibilities. If the children aren't obligated and hard to get the children to walk there, or get there, you didn't necessarily have enough donkeys to take everybody or whatever it might be, it's hard. So it's a difficult mitzvah to fulfill. So on the one hand, we want to have this for everybody. On the other hand, we understand that it's not always so easy for all these people to get there. And that's why maybe this one about the legs and anyone who can't physically get there. And then it's not talking only about people who physically can't get there, but also people who have other things that are pulling them back that make it hard for them to get there. And not to mention also this, interesting. I see what you're saying. The shotez may be mentally unhealthy and not mentally disabled. Maybe, right. You could say that. I think it really does mean mentally disabled though. And mentally disabled people sometimes are not as mentally healthy, like throwing things and all that. That's also a typical syndrome of not even someone who's mentally disturbed, but just someone who's mentally disabled. Often they do things like that as well. In any case, I think, right, and someone, let's take mental disability, right? It's harder for them to do things in general, to keep halachot, right? It's a very important exemption. It's not just saying, oh, you don't have dat, you're not on the ins here. It's really not viewing it like that. It's really viewing it as, it's hard for you to keep mitzvah. We understand that. So we're not going to require you. You need a certain amount of intellectual ability. Obviously, it depends on the mitzvah. But I think it's another way to understand all these exemptions. So with that, we're going to move on. And now we're going to see drashot, explanations about all the different people and where we learn from the Torah that they're exempt. Tumtum v'androginus v'chulei. So that's just the quote from the Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan. So here comes the Braita that's going to exclude, and it's actually going to include someone that's not going to really make any sense, which we'll have to explain. Zachor, remember it says, Yera'eh kol zichorcha. Okay, all males will appear. So obviously, if it says males, right? So zichor, it says zichorcha, which is a strange language. It could have just said, Yera'eh kol zachal. Why did it say zichorcha? To teach you two different drashot. Okay, often they do that by the way the word comes out. You can learn two things. Zichor, just that part of the word, is lahotziat hanashim. That obviously says, okay, women know because it says male. Zichorcha lahotzi tumtum v'androginus. The fact that it says cha, that adds that extra letter, which isn't really necessary, comes to exclude the tumtum and the androginus. So now the third is kol zichorcha. Now the pasuk says, Yera'eh will be seen all zichorcha. So now we get to why all. L'rabot et haktanim, to include minors, children. Okay, this is strange. Didn't we see in the Mishnah that children are exempt? Cheresh shotet v'katan. We'll have to get back to this. So that's a quote from the Braita. Now we're going to go into each section of the Braita and ask questions. Amar Zechor lo tziat hanashim. Halam alikha. Why do I need a pasuk for this? Why would I need a pasuk? Because why wouldn't I need a pasuk? Because this is a time-bound, positive time-bound mitzvah. Going out the you have to do it at particular times of the year. That's time-bound. And every positive time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt. Not every, there's exceptions to the rule. We'll see all this when we get to Kiddushin, but women are exempt. Right? Again, we don't really know why, right? The example I brought of my daughter being sick is a good possibility about why, right? It obviously doesn't apply to people who don't have children. It doesn't apply to people whose children are older. Yeah, all sorts of. But there are many women in that stage of life. So that would be possibly one explanation. Again, there's different explanations brought. As usual, we don't really know. In fact, the most interesting explanation is that it's not really connected to the reason. It's that they looked at all the mitzvot that they knew women were exempt from, and they tried to give it a title, and they gave it a title. And that's why there's all these exceptions anyway. But there's all sorts of interesting things to say there, but not for a Daf Yomi class. Okay. Women are exempt. So basically, why do you need a verse to tell us this? If it's a rule, a principle that applies across the board, so that would make sense. So, and then you don't need a drasha for it. So they say, no, you need a drasha. Why? Let's go back to what we learned already. What did we learn? We made this comparison, hakel and re'iyah, because they both say to be seen by God. So what do we know now? Well, hakel, what does it say there? Nashim, right? The anashim, nashim, and ta, men, women, and children. So you might have thought, maybe we should learn it from hakel. Just like women are obligated in hakel, maybe they also are obligated in re'iyah. Kamash malan. Therefore, it comes to teach us, no, they're exempt. Amar mar. So now we're going to go to the second one. Okay, so we understood now why we need a special drasha for women. Why do we need a special drasha for tumtum and androginus? Bishlama androginus itzrich. Okay, androginus, remember, has simanim of male and female. So now, why them? Well, it's very obvious. You might have thought, it's kind of, half man, half woman or something like that, however you would call it. But it's a weird way to say it, but, it has male attributes and female. So it has a male side, so that he would be included. That's part of him would be included in that part of the androgynous would be included in the zechorcha. So now they say, so why do we need a verse then? Kamash malan. And what's the verse teaching us then? Because theoretically, it really should, that kind of person should be included. Kamash malan de bria b'fnei atzmo. This is to teach you androgynous is its own. There's male, there's female, there's androgynous. It's not like it has male, it has female. It's a separate category entirely. Okay, this sounds like a modern discussion almost of, right? Things that come up more nowadays that weren't as apparent those days, but that it's something unique, it's different. Now, Ella tumtum is sveikahu. Now, here we're going to have a big issue. And this is something that comes up a few other times in the Gemara, and it's always a debate exactly how to explain it. I'm going to explain it according to one interpretation, but there are other ways. But there's mainly two ways to understand this. But anyway, a tumtum is someone who their genitals are covered. We don't know what they are. So that's what we call a suffix. Is this being male or is this being female? Now, you're going to now say this pasuk is coming to exclude a case of doubt, to which the Gemara is going to say, do we need a verse to get rid of a suffix? Meaning what? What does it mean? It means, would the Torah relate to a suffix? What's a suffix? A suffix is we have a doubt about something. There is no real suffix. What is suffix? Suffix is we just don't know, but there's a reality. There's an objective reality, which means God knows there's an what the truth is, right? We just don't know, almost like the teku, right? We don't know what the answer is. What this is saying, and again, there's some difficulties with this way of explaining, which is why some people explain it otherwise. But what it's basically saying is if we believe, right, that God wrote the Torah. So if God wrote the Torah and God included this verse to give us some sort of explanation about what to do in a doubt situation, it's saying that God understands that there's doubts. And God, what do you mean? There are no doubts according to God. And there's the Torah, and the Torah talks about definitive situations. And then we have situations that we don't understand what category they fall into. But God wouldn't be relating to doubtful categories. God will relate to actual things. We then, as humans, say, well, we don't understand where to fit that into what category. But it doesn't make sense that there would be a verse coming to relate to a doubt, because there are no doubts in front of God. One can make arguments for that. The Torah was written for us, for humans. Okay, and therefore there are other interpretations, but we'll stick with that one for right now. So now, Amar Abaye, Kisha Beitzav mi bachutz. This is a very strange answer. This is basically saying that there's a type of tumtum where part of the genitals are exposed, which are the testicles, and the rest is not. And therefore, it, yes, is in the category of a tumtum, but it's clear there's some male elements. And therefore, we're going to basically say that's what we need the verse for. Not a case where it's a total doubt and we have no idea. It's more similar to the androgynous case. Okay, it's a bit of a strange answer because that's not usually what we think of a tumtum. Okay, next. Amar kol zechurcha lerabot et haktanim. So now we have this strange thing that kol, all males, comes to include children that are males. Why is it strange? Because we'll see in the Gemara, as they say, and as I mentioned, Hadran, doesn't it say in our Mishnah, chutz mechere shotev katan, right? Exempting children. So Amar Abaye lo kashya, kam b'katan shegiah lechinuch, kam b'katan shelo egiah lechinuch. We have two different stages of a katan. There's katan who's too young for anything, any type of education. And then we have a katan who you're obligated already to teach them. Like this is, I'll give you a good example. Many people, the year or two before Yom Kippur, right? The kids fast already to teach them. And people say the year before bar or bat mitzvah, you have to fast. That's midin chinuch, to get the children ready for when they're actually going to be obligated. So if you remember, our Mishnah talked about a very young age for katan, right? Either you can't ride on someone's shoulders or you know, the age where you can start walking by yourself, right? As long as you can go on the shoulders or start walking, then you're already obligated. So the katan in this braita is that kind of katan, but you're not obligated yet fully, right? You're obligated midin chinuch, not because you're actually obligated in mitzvah, but because of laws of teaching the children to do things that they should be doing, right? From here, you can learn about bringing kids to shul or something like that, right? So now they say, wait a minute. So now we have this word kol in the Torah that comes to teach you a katan shegiah lechinuch, let's say, who's 5 years old or something, can already walk, or 6 or 7, right? Depending on how well the children walk. So they're obligated, midin chinuch, but not from, well, so now it's, right, how do you say it? Not by actual Torah law. Well, that's tricky because we just said kol is a word in the Torah to come and include that. So the Gemara is going to ask, katan shegiah lechinuch de rabbanan. That's only rabbinic. When you get to the age of mitzvot, again, it's not so clear what the Tanaim thought was the age of mitzvot. But there's an age of, we're now learning that there was a certain stage, and then there was a later stage. At the first stage, you're obligated, the parent is obligated really to teach the child how to do it. The later stage, the child's already obligated because the child's obligated. Okay, whether we call it 13 or 12 or simanim on the body or puberty signs, right? There's a whole interesting discussion about how this whole topic developed. Okay, Professor Gilat is known, he wrote a lot about this, how the whole age thing developed over time and how in the time of the Tanaim, for sure, it was much more fluid. And we've seen this in a number of cases where, you know, it all depends on each mitzvah and what the kid's ability to do that mitzvah is. But either which way, the whole law of chinuch is rabbinic. So how can you say there's a Torah verse that's coming to include rabbinic? So they say, in Achinami, you're right. It is really only rabbinic. Ukras machteba'almahu. Or without the word who, but that means the same thing. The kra is just, the pasuk is just, we just connect it to the pasuk in order to help remember, right? We have this idea that we don't often, right? In order to remember certain halachot, the rabbi is connected to a verse. So they say, all Coppersmith teacher children are included once they're at the age of chinuch, but that doesn't mean that it's a Torah obligation. It's rabbinic. They just connected it to the pasuk. To which the Gemara asks, okay, so what does the real pasuk then mean? What does it mean on a Doraita level? Ela krala ma'ata. So why does it say call from a Torah level? Okay, there must be, in other words, yes, the rabbis can connect it to a verse and say kol comes to include children, and that's how you remember that children are obligated. But that's only rabbinic. What is the real word doing there in the Torah? L'chida acherim. Now we're going to see a really interesting, and this is a whole different category. If we put all the first categories of all the people who are exempt. And maybe this will help you because I see there was a little discussion in the chat. I didn't follow the whole thing, but about that these people are not forbidden to go on Aliyah Regel. They're just exempt. And that's why I put it before. And, you know, that it's nice for them to go, but they don't have to go because it might be difficult for them to go. These next category we're going to talk about and a few later are going to be people who actually can't go. And in fact, I think I mentioned this, but I don't remember. But there's a famous case of Ishto shel Yona al tala regel, and the rabbis were fine with it, right? There's all sorts of cases where people did things that they weren't obligated to do, and it was questioned, did the rabbis accept it, did they not accept it? One of them is this example of Ishto shel Yona his wife went on aliyah regel, and the rabbis were fine with it. So it seems like it's definitely not a problem if people want to go. But here we're going to have people that are not allowed to go. It's a very strange category. You might be surprised by this. I was surprised by it. Acherim omrim. other people say. Okay, so we're bringing this word kol is for the drasha of acherim. Acherim say, hamekametz v'hametzaref nechoshet v'haborsi pturim min ha're'iyah. Okay, mekametz is someone who gathers all the dog poop that's around. Okay, this maybe would be a good job if they had in my neighborhood, although it has gotten better, but it's not great. So it's a pretty disgusting job, and people are smelly, right? Now, mitzaref nechoshet, a silver, what do you call it? A bronze, I don't remember always all the words, but a smith. So he's also apparently smells, and copper, thank you. I always confuse all those words. So a coppersmith. And then a borsi. A borsi is a leather. He tans the leather. Those always we talk about are smelly, disgusting jobs. So all of these people smell. And because of that, this is fascinating. Ptulim min ha're'iyah. They're exempt from the mitzvah. Why? Mishum shene'emar kol zichorcha. Mi shechol la'alot in kol zichorcha. Yatzu elu she'enam ru'iyim la'alot in kol zichorcha. It has to be someone who can actually go on aliyah l'regel with all the males. Now imagine, right, if you've ever walked to the Kotel on Shavuot morning and you see all these people coming and tons of hordes of people coming together, could you imagine if you were basically walking with all these smelly people? It would be disgusting. So these people are exempt because they're disgusting. Now you might say that's crazy, right? So first of all, some of the commentaries say that they're actually they're not just stam exempt, but they're supposed to clean themselves off, change their clothes, and then go. But if they're still in their dirty clothes, they actually are exempt, okay? Because it's a hazard to other people, right? It's unpleasant for other people. We want to make this a beautiful experience and not a disgusting experience. These people are what we call in Hebrew, the word would be ma'us, right? They're disgusting. We don't want them near us. Keep in mind this word because the Rambam is going to define some other people as ma'usim that are also not allowed to go to the temple. Nashim. Now we're moving on. So again, so far what we've done is, after we finished with that issue of defining shoteh, we took this tumtum androgynous women, we brought the drashot that taught about them, then we brought this, in the context of that, we had kol, which included the katan, which we said, what's that? We then said, oh, that's only rabbinic, midin chinuch, as opposed to our Mishnah, which was under the age of chinuch. And then we said kol really comes for this extra drasha. And the tumtum androgynous and the women, we had to ask by all of them, what was the point of having a drasha? Wouldn't you know, even without a drasha? And to each one, we had an explanation. Now we're moving on to the avadim. So the Mishnah says, also, it's a bit of a strange language. We'll get back to that in a few minutes. Nashim v'avadim she'einam meshucharim. Women and slaves, Canaanite slaves that are not freed. So bishlama nashim kedamaran. So the women part, we already explained, because what happened was in terms of the flow of the Gemara first wanted to deal with tumtum and androgynous, not women. But since in the Braita they quoted, they had the tumtum and androgynous, it also related to women, so they dealt with the women aspect. Now they're moving to the next thing, which is women and slaves. So now they say, okay, we dealt with the women already, check. El avadim minalan, what about women? Amar Rav Huna amalcha. The pasuk says, El pnei ha'adon Hashem. You're supposed to go to greet the face of your master, God. Misha Einlo El Adon Echad. So it's only someone, well, Ha'adon means the master. Now, there's people who have more than one master. So, Yatzazeh Sheyesh Lo Adon Acher. This slave has two Adonim. They have God and they have another master. So he's on the outs because of this. So again, the Gemara is going to ask, same question. Halam alikra, what do you need a verse for? Michti, we already learned that kol mitzvah she'isha chayevet ba'eved chayava. Women and slaves are exempt from the exact same things. Again, we talked about this before, not necessarily for the same reasons. Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Depends why you think women are right. Not because women are slaves, right? But again, women have responsibilities. Slaves have responsibilities that they can't necessarily always get out of, right? My proof yesterday morning. So, kol mitzvah she'isha chayevet ba'eved chayav ba. Kol mitzvah she'ena isha chayevet ba'ena eved chayav ba. Any mitzvah that a woman is obligated, the slave is also obligated. Any mitzvah that the woman's not obligated, the slave is not obligated. So there, once you take women out of the picture, you should take slaves. Now, how do we know this? Well, we learn this from what we get. Again, we call it Gzera Shava. The same word appearing in two different places. I'm just going to remind you about Gzera Shava. You can't just make one up on your own. It has to be that you had a tradition about it. But we have a tradition about this Gzera Shava. La me'isha. Okay, I brought the two verses on your sheet if you want. The first one is in Dvarim, Perek Kaf Daled, Pasuk Aleph. Ki ikash ish isha u'ba'ala, when a man marries a woman, vayayin lo timtzah chen be'einav, if he decides he wants to divorce her, ki matzah be'ervat davar. I'm not going to get into all the details. We have Seder Nashim coming up. We'll spend a lot of time on that pasuk. V'katav la sefer kritut. He writes for her, that's the word la, a sefer kritut, a divorce document. Next, we're now going to move to Vayikra Yud Tet, when it's talking about a shivcha charufa. It's a type of slave maidservant that a woman sleeps with. In Pasuk Kaf, v'ish ki yishkav et isha shechatzera v'hi shivcha necheret li'ish. She was a maidservant that was designated for someone else. V'efder lo niftatan, she wasn't redeemed. O chufsha lo nitan la, or she wasn't freed. Okay, so here you have slaves, freed, not freed, and the word la appears. Now, even though it's talking about a slave woman, they're going to learn from here to a slave man. Okay, and everything that's true for a woman is true for a slave. So therefore, there's no point for this drasha because we already know slaves are exempt from women. So Amar Ravina lo nitzcha ela lemisha chetziu eved v'chetziu ben chorin. If you remember, Ravina was the one who pointed out that these were exempt. Half slave, half free. If he was fully slave, for sure he'd be exempt. We know that from women. The drasha is to teach you about what's someone who's chetziu ben chorin, who has more than one adon, right? He's got two masters. He's got God and the master who hasn't redeemed him. And now we get back to what I mentioned before, Daikanami, Dekatani. We can further prove this from the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Nashim v'avadim she'einam mishucharim, that are not freed. Now that's a weird language. Every time it says Eved, it just says Eved, right? Slave. Why does it say Ma she'einam mishucharim? Why do we have to say who isn't freed? Ilay ma she'einam mishucharim klal. If we think they're not freed at all, well, litne avadim stama. It should just say the word avadim, slaves. It must be that they're not fully freed. They've been freed by one master, not by the second. And who obviously would that be? Who's only not mishuchar legamre? That's mishachetziu eved v'chetziu ben chorin shmamina. So that's how he concludes. That answers our question. Again, we've basically been asking the same questions all throughout, which is, why do you need a drasha? Doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that needs a drasha. And each time we've said it needs it for a particular reason. We're now getting to the next category in the Mishnah, people who have trouble walking, right? Again, the suma doesn't have any problem with his legs, but because he's blind, it's harder to walk places. And the chole is sick, can't walk, the zaken is elderly. Tanu Rabbanan, where do we learn this from? The Braita is going to give us a proof. Rigalim, because it says 3 rigalim, which right, we're so used to shalosh rigalim, but it's a weird language. It should be shalosh, right? Shlosha chagim. Why rigalim? To teach you legs, prat lebale kabin, right? Someone who has fake legs. Davar acher, rigalim, prat lechiger, ulechole, ulesuma, ulezaken, v'sheino yachol la'alot b'raglav. Okay, it's coming to exclude anyone who's going to have trouble walking. Sheino yachol la'alot b'raglav. So now they say, wait, let's take those words that appear both in the Braita and they appeared in our Mishnah, and let's try to understand them. Latu yeman. You already gave us the category. You don't need to tell us the title of the category. Certainly at the end, when you've already done this, it must be coming to include something else. Amarava, moving to the next page now, Talmud bet, la tuye mifanke. People who are what we call mefunakim. Okay, what is mefunakim here? So Rashi gives us one explanation. They have trouble walking without shoes. Without shoes. They always need to wear shoes, right? Some people can't handle walking on sand, walking on dirt, right? It disgusts them. It's very hard for them. So someone like that's going to be exempt from coming to the temple. Why? Dichtiv. Ki tavo le'ra'ot panai mi bikesh miyetchem. Famous pasuk from Yechezkel. We're going to see this later in today's daf as well. When you come to see my face in the temple, God says in the beginning of Sefer Yeshayahu, when God basically starts complaining, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want you coming to my temple anymore, right? God being very upset. Ki tavo le'ra'ot panai mi bikesh miyetchem. Ramos chatzerai. Who asked this from you? You're trampling my courtyards. What does it mean, trampling? You're walking on it with shoes. You can't walk with shoes. So anyone who can't survive walking without shoes is also exempt. Interesting exemption. Yes. Okay. Tana, new category. Now we're going to get back to this thing about being ma'us, a little despicable or disgusting. Ha'arel va'tamei p'turim min ha're'iyah. Now, even though we generally don't say that tamei people are disgusting in any way, right? Certainly if we think about as women, nida, tamei, all that. However, when it comes to the temple, tuma was not allowed, right? And it was considered despicable to be in the temple when one is, not everyone calls it despicable. The Rambam in Hilchot Chagigah, Perek Bet Halacha Aleph, if you want to look, which is found in the Rambam's book of Korbanot, not in holidays, but in Korbanot. Right? Chagigah as a Masechet is in Moed, which is all about the holidays. But in the Rambam, it's in Hilchot Korbanot, sacrifices, because it's all about the Chagigah sacrifice. There he talks about the Arel and Tamei, and he calls them Meusim, okay, that it's kind of disgusting to have those people come into the temple. So they're exempt. So now the Gemara says, Bishlama Tamei. Okay, so notice, by the way, these weren't in our Mishnah, which may be further proof. these people and the people who were smelly, right? They weren't mentioned in the Mishnah because that's a whole different category that the Mishnah wasn't relating to. Why the Mishnah doesn't mention them, I don't know. But again, that's one category of people who can't come, as opposed to the category of people who are exempt, but if they want to, they can. So now it says, Tameh patur min hariyah. How do we know? I'm sorry. Bishlama tameh. I skipped down by accident until further down where it repeats it. Bishlama tameh dichtivu bata shama ve'beta shama. Okay, this is a verse in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 12, that talks about when you get to the land, and then you get to the place where I chose for the temple, where that will be chosen, you should ubata shama, you should go there. Ve'hevetam shama, and that's where you should go bring all your sacrifices. So they make what we call a not exera shava here. This is what we call a heked, juxtaposition of two things in the same verse. Because of that, we say, kol sheyeshno bebi'ah, yeshno b'hava'ah. Anyone who can come brings. Kol she'eno bebi'ah, eno b'hava'ah. Anyone who can't come doesn't bring. So if a tameh can't come into the temple, because we know that, comes up in other verses, you're not allowed to go into the temple if you're tameh to the azara. Remember, that's why we talked about this. The Lishkat HaMetzoraim, it was a while ago already, but is one of the places that's in the Ezra Nashim. It's right outside the azara. You can't go into the azara without, right, if you're Metzora, because you're tameh, right? But you have to be there because you have to get sprinkled with the blood and the oil and all that. Anyway, that's a whole separate thing. But now they say, so therefore, that if you can't, we learned this also in our last Masechet. What did we learn? In Moed Katan, is a Metzora obligated to bring sacrifices, right? Could he send his sacrifices with somebody else? Remember when we said he can't, because if he can't come, well, then you can't bring. So, kol she'eno bebi'ah, eno b'hava'ah. So therefore, the tameh, it's clear you're not obligated because you're not allowed to bring sacrifices. Ela arel min adam. By the way, as opposed to our Mishnah, where we weren't sure, does Riyah mean coming to the temple or does it mean sacrifices? This source is clearly meaning sacrifices. Otherwise, there's no way to explain it. Ariel, where do we get it from? Someone who's uncircumcised. Now, someone can be uncircumcised for two reasons. One is they just didn't deal with it. Two is they couldn't. Some people, for health reasons, can't get circumcised, or if their two brothers died from circumcision, then you don't circumcise the third. So even if it's not your doing, but you're Ariel, uncircumcised, you can't. Where do we get this from? Well, Hamani Rabbi Akiva. This is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. He says an uncircumcised person is like someone who's tameh. Okay, this is also thought of as somewhat despicable, someone who doesn't have a circumcision. Okay, why? I'm not, that's a whole good question. Ditanya, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ish, this is Ish, who's a Mitzarua or Zav, and all these things. It talks about how you can't come into the Machaneh, you can't come into the temple, and, depending on who you are, where else you can't go. It says Ish, what is Ish? L'rabota ta'arel. The Ariel isn't mentioned in the verse. They're talking about people who are Tameh, but they say, Ish. It's repeated twice to teach you an additional person who else would be like the Tameh, if not an uncircumcised person. Now we're going to bring a Braita. This is really unnecessary. In this Braita, we're going to do two things. One is bring a source, a Braita that proves exactly the drasha we just said. And another is to repeat a different drasha. The second part of the Braita repeats a different drasha that we already saw in Daf Bet. So this is all review. Tanu Rabbanan, Tameh patur min hariyah. The tameh person is exempt from the mitzvah of coming of the sacrifice. Dichtiv ubata shama ve'vetem shama. Kol sheyeshno bebi'ah, yeshno b'hava'ah. Kol she'eno bebi'ah, eno b'hava'ah. Right? Again, if you're part of, you can come, then you bring. If you're not part of coming, then you can't bring. Rabbi Yochanan ben Davai omer mishum Rabbi Yehuda suma be'echam einav patur min hariyah. This right is to bring another person. A suma who's is blind in one eye is exempt. Remember, it was a debate about this. Shenemal yir'eh yera'eh. Some people have it yera'eh yir'eh. There's two different ways to read this. I'm going to read it in one way only, but know that there's another commentary. Kederech sheba lir'ot, kach ba le'ra'ot. The way you come to see, that's how you come to be seen. Now, who's seeing here? Because to be seen, you have to come with two eyes. So what does it mean to see? You come with two eyes. So what it means is the way some people interpret it. And again, there's difficulties with this one, which is why there's another way, but I'm going to go with one right now. The way you come to see that God wants to come see you. God is the subject here, according to one interpretation. The way God sees you, which is with two eyes, even though God doesn't have eyes. And right, but the idea is that God can see you fully, however he can see you. Therefore, you're obligated to be seen in that same way. You have to have two eyes the same way God has two eyes. You have to be at full strength, so to speak. Okay, so that was that came in just because we were quoting this Braita. And the Braita finished with that, and we already learned this drasha already. Now we're going to have a whole new section, which is going to end on today's daf with an interesting story, but it's going to continue further into tomorrow with all these verses that cause the rabbis to cry. Okay, one of these emotional pages. Okay, Rav Huna, kimate lahai kra yir'eh yera'eh. Some people get rid of one of them because it has nothing to do with the drasha of yir'eh yera'eh. Okay, but someone, when he got to this pasuk about yir'eh, that we should go and appear before God in the temple, you have to remember, a lot of this has to do with they are living after the destruction of the temple, and they don't have this opportunity anymore. So we discussed at our Siyum for Moed, right? That in the lack of that, there's always, how do we fill this in with other things? So we get to this pasuk, and he cried, Amar, Eved Sherabo Mitzapelo Liroto. And it's not just because we don't have the temple, but he's going to quote this terrible pasuk in Yeshayahu. It says, let's imagine this the way we could imagine it, right? How do we imagine it? We have a servant whose master is waiting for him, right? Often you have a very good relationship. They're waiting for the master to come, for the servant to come serve them. And yitrachek mimenu, but then he's going to distance himself from him. That's right. That's exactly what happens here. Dichtiv. This is the verse we quoted before. Ki tavo leraot panai mi bikesho mietchem ramos chatzeirai. You're coming to see me, right? And so I can see you. Guess what? I don't want this. You're trampling my courtyards. Get out of here. That's terrible, right? So that made him cry. Now, what's interesting is not the pasuk in Yeshayahu made him cry, but the pasuk in the Torah, that this is the ideal, and the ideal is just not happening anymore. Same person. I want you to pay attention to the people, not that it makes such a difference, but each one, many of them have two verses that make them cry. These are both very similar. Rav Huna kimati lahai kra bache. Again, Rav Huna would cry at this pasuk, v'zavachta shlamim b'achalta sham. Should bring sacrifices and eat there. Evet shechabom etzapeh le'echol al shulchano, right? The servant is planning to eat on the table of his master is waiting for him to come eat with him. Yitrachek mimenu, but then he's going to distance himself. Right? God says, I don't want your sacrifices anymore. Because remember, Shea was all about echtav ashuv, right? You're going to sin and then go back. And I don't want that. You're basically, your sacrifices are nothing. Right? What about mishpat? What about tzedek? What about righteousness? Right? It's all about, you think you can just worship God and that's good and you're fine, but you're really not. Rabbi Elazar, kimati lahai kra bache. He would get to the following pasuk and he would cry. This seems to be a bit of a different theme, but similar about the relationship between God and us. V'lo yachlu achiv la'anot oto ki nevalu mipanav. When Yosef comes and reveals himself to the brothers couldn't answer him because they were scared of him. If the reprimand of a regular person causes that kind of reaction in people, when God reprimands us, right, how much worse that is. Rabbi Elazar, kimati lahai kra bache. Vayom Shmuel el Shaul, lama hirgaztani la'alot oti. Very famous story in Sefer Shmuel, where Shmuel is dead. Shaul asked the prophets, he asked the Urim Bitumim, he doesn't get any answer, he doesn't notice to go out to war. He gets desperate, he goes to a Balat of a woman who brings up the dead, and he resurrects Shmuel from the dead. And Shmuel says to him, why did you anger me to raise me up like this? So why was he so angry, Shmuel? Because he says, I'm scared that if you bring me back to the world, I'm going to be judged again, and maybe I'll be judged negatively. So he was so scared, and that's Shmuel. How much more so us? So now we want to understand, how do we know that he was scared of the judgment? Shmuel Maihi, Dichtiv, Vatoma Haisha, this is the Ba'alat of El Shaul, Elohim Ra'iti Olim. She says to Shaul, I see an important man coming up, but the word Olim is plural. So Elohim doesn't necessarily need to be plural, but Elohim is definitely plural. Olim, Trey Mashma, it sounds like two people came up. Chad Shmuel, V'idach, and what about the other one? Ta'azal Shmuel v'ayte l'Moshe b'hadeh. He brought Moshe up with him. Why Moshe? Amar lei, dilma chas v'shalom l'dina mitbein. Now maybe they'll judge me. And kum b'hadai, come up with me, delei kamilta dekatap b'oraita delo kiyamte. So you can prove that there's nothing it says in the Torah that I didn't do. Okay. First of all, how would Moshe know? Moshe wasn't alive in Shmuel's time. So they say something interesting. I read a commentary, which is good, which talks about all the development of halacha and stuff, that basically what Shmuel wanted to say was that if I claim I did something and people say that's not what the Torah said, I'll have Moshe on my side to say that's what I meant when I said it. Okay, which is interesting because we all know that the Torah develops, and it's not always necessarily, right, that famous story of Moshe and Rabbi Akiva, where Rabbi Akiva is darshaning and Moshe doesn't know what he's talking about. Anyway, it's interesting. Okay, next, Rabbi Ami. Ki mate lahai kra bachi. Now the next three are going to be on the same theme. Yitem ba'afar piu ulai yesh tikva. This says pasuk in Echad. again, destruction of the temple. You're going to be eating dust. Maybe there's hope. Says, Amar, Kule, Hai, Ve'ulai. We went through all this. Maybe there's hope. I don't want to know that maybe there's hope. I want to know there is hope, right? That made him cry. Rabbi Ami, another pasuk made Rabbi Ami cry. Kimati lahai krabache, same idea. Bakshu tzedek, bakshu anava, ulai tisatru b'yom Hashem. Seek tzedek, right? Justice. Seek anava, try to be humble. Maybe you'll be saved when God, when his day of anger comes. Maybe you'll be hidden and you won't get his anger. Amar, kule hai ve'ulai, all this and maybe, right? I'm going to spend my whole life and maybe this will help me. Rabbi Asi kimaita lahat krabache, same idea, but this is Rabbi Asi, not Rabbi Ami. Sin'ura ve'ehevu tov, hate bad and love good. V'atzigu b'shar mishpat, and do justice. Ulai yechanan Hashem lo ketzvah, maybe God will, do good for you. Kule hai ve'ulai. Rabbi Yosef kimaita lahai krabache. Rabbi Yosef will cry from the following pasuk. From here, we're going to get into a very interesting, maybe spooky story. It's a pasuk from Mishlei. It says, there are those who die without judgment. And when we read this, we think of, we always say everyone has a right to be put on trial and be judged and with a judge, etc. But this really means to be saying some people die for no reason. Okay. So Amal, below Zimne, when he got to this pasuk, he cried and he said, what? Is that really true? Do people die before their time? How could that be? Right? This is the age-old question. Right? Sadiq viralo. How could that be that people die when they really didn't deserve it? So they answer him, yes, it could be. Could be that people die when they're really not supposed to. Kihad Rabbebi bar Abaye. We're now going to hear a story about Rabbebi bar Abaye. And as I said, we're going to continue a little bit. I'm going to steer from my norm and finish up tomorrow's daf so I don't leave you with nightmares. And also because tomorrow's daf is long. Anyway, what does he say? So Rabbebi bar Abaye have a shachiach gabe malach hamavet. He would hang out with Malach HaMavet, okay? Again, you have to understand the story wasn't a real story. They're trying to highlight an idea. They tell you a story about, imagine that Rabbi Ravai is, has a communication with the Malach HaMavet. Amar leila shluche. So he sees the following thing happen. He sees the Malach HaMavet sending his messenger. Okay, the angel of death sends his messenger. Zil aitele Miriam Megadla Se'ar Neshaya. Go bring me, right? It's her turn to die. Miriam, the woman who braids the hair of women. Azo Aitile, Miriam Megadla Dardike. He accidentally brings him Miriam, who brings up the children. Okay, very, it's like the Kabsa Bar Kamsa story, right? Except you think that story is bad. This is much worse. She dies. Amarle, Ana Miriam Megadla Se'ar Neshaya Amrelach, right? The Malach HaMavet says, who'd you bring me? You got it all wrong. Amarle, Ihachi Ahadri says, okay, I'll bring her back. This story reminded me of the movie Heaven Can Wait, for those who saw it, right? Where the guy comes up, they made a mistake, and then he claims, right, what happens? He's in a tunnel. For those who don't know, he's on a motorcycle. He's a famous football player, and he's about to get into a car accident, and they bring him up to heaven. And he says, but I didn't die, and they said, well, you were going to die. I wanted to save you the pain of dying. And basically, he claims, bring me back to life, but it's kind of too late, and he can't, and he ends up going into the soul, puts his soul into someone else's body. Anyway, it's a great movie, and it very much reminds me of this. So since she's already here, she'll be part of my, of my count. So now he says to him, well, how did you manage to kill her? Like, I don't understand. So this is why it really reminded me of Heaven Can Wait, because what's the story in Heaven Can Wait? He's about to get into an accident. He's in the danger zone, okay, which is exactly what they're going to say here. And it's exactly what we learned in Masechet Tani. Remember, if you walk by this kotel that's shaking, then when you're in the area of danger, the mizikim can get to you. Okay, so now, Havanakita Matara Biyade. So what he explains is the woman had a shovel. She was cleaning out the oven. She put it by accident on herself. What happened? It burnt her, and she was already in a place where her luck went sour, and I was able to take her, right? She put herself in the danger zone. I was able to get her very easily. Amra baby bar Abaye. So first of all, it's unclear, depending on what commentary, it seems like this was a discussion maybe the Malach HaMavet was having with his messenger about how did you get her, or maybe Rabbi was asking the messenger, but now we're going to have Rabbi asking the Malach HaMavet himself. Unclear whether that conversation was also Malach HaMavet or not. Right? Do you really have the rights to do this? Like, let's be honest. This is not exactly the way things are supposed to work. Amar le, what do you mean? I have a verse to rely on. There's no, right? You don't go without judgment. Yeah, some people die without judgment. Amar le, what do you mean? Each generation has its time. This generation goes, the next one comes. So yeah, everyone has their own time. No. The way it works is like this. The Melech HaMavet describes. I take everybody, I keep them until the generation is full. Everyone in that generation dies. Then I hand them over. Hadran Mishlim le Duma. Then I give them to Duma. That's what Dor Holech V'Dorba. That's already, once people are dead, I keep the whole generation. I move them. Duma is the angel that's in charge of the souls. He comes up in all sorts of interesting places. Anyway, we'll get to him in other places. I give them to Duma. He's in charge of them after that. That's what it means. So Amarle sof sof shnei ma'avid. But what did you do with the years? Like, this person was supposed to live till age 80 and you killed them at age 70. What about those 10 years? Amar yikatsorva merabanan demavir b'mile mosifna lehule v'hav yachilufe. If I find a Talmid Chacham who's very calm and doesn't get angry when people do things to them, it's called mavir al midotav, then I add it to him, and those years of her or him get given over to that person. And that's how I resolve it, which is a very interesting way to resolve it. You can think that maybe that's a little bit unfair. What's the story doing? How do we relate to it? It's a really good question. I think, first of all, you see from the last line, they're trying to show that that you should learn Torah, and not only learn Torah, it's more than that. It's learn Torah and be a good person together, right? You need that combination. It's super important. Someone who has both that and that, you can maybe get extra years added onto your life. Okay. What it relates to is that there's things we don't understand about why people die. When we look at it without seeing the Melech HaMavet's perspective, we just say, why did she die? And it turns out it was a mistake. Maybe it's saying also it's not God. He has an angel, and his angel has a messenger. And anytime you pass things down from person to person, there's broken telephone, there's mistakes that happen, just like humans make mistakes. Also, things like this can sometimes be mistakes. And sometimes, maybe that's a way to look at it. Again, it's hard to swallow that because it's a really serious mistake and one that could be really detrimental. Anyway, interesting thing to think about. We will end here for today. Shavua Tov to you.